My wife lay there, blood staining the floor. The place that was once our home was now a crime scene. The man who attacked her was her stepfather, someone who was supposed to be family. But the punch that truly squeezed my heart was not from him, but from her own mother. She stood in the corner of the room trembling, her eyes wide open, watching her daughter, who was protecting her, being beaten unconscious. Not a single scream, not a single action to save her child. Witnessing everything without intervening, her silence was more brutal than any blow. And when the person you love most is knocked to the floor, covered in blood, and their own mother chooses to just stand and watch, what will you do to get justice? I am David Carter, a U.S. Army captain. I've been through many war zones, seen enough death, and I thought I had left all the darkness behind when I returned home. On the battlefield, I was a soldier, but at home, I was just Sarah's husband. We got married right after I returned from my last mission, and since then, everything in our small apartment was a testament to a new beginning. Simple breakfasts, laughter in the middle of the night, and Sarah holding me after a nightmare. She was my peace. She was the place where all the chaos of the outside world had to stop at the door. She was the one who taught a guy like me that silence isn't always tension, and that some mornings, the smell of coffee and her laughter were enough. She was my family. The end of every mission. The reason for me to come back. That was the life I had sworn to protect at all costs. And that's what helped me get through the last 18-hour shift. The thought of coming home to her. But as I turned into my building, a cold sense of dread crept into my chest. The door to our apartment was ajar. My heart tightened. Sarah never left the door like that. I pushed the door open and walked in. The scene in the room was like a cold knife, cutting straight into my chest. Sarah was slumped on the rug in the middle of the living room. A dark red trail of blood was trickling from the corner of her mouth. Above her, Richard Kane, her stepfather, was staggering, his face flushed with alcohol and rage. His hand was clenched, clearly ready for another blow. But what made my heart skip a beat was in the corner of the room. Sarah's mother, Helen, stood frozen there. Her hands were clasped over her mouth, her eyes wide, tear-filled, and full of horror. But she was completely silent. Not a single scream, not a single act of intervention. She just stood there, trembling, a silent spectator to her own daughter's hell. In that moment, every emotion in me froze. There was no screaming, no panic. Only a deadly stillness enveloped my mind. The soldier in me took control. Richard turned, realizing I was there. His eyes blazed. "You." Before he could finish the sentence, he lunged at me. But I didn't back down. I twisted, using his own momentum and my body weight to throw him to the floor. I put him in a chokehold, just enough so he couldn't move or scream, only utter angry groans. My left hand held Richard tight, while my right reached for the military radio on my belt. I pressed the button. My voice was steady, without a hint of a tremor. "Captain Carter here. Requesting military police to Building 2B, domestic violence situation. Casualties. Repeat, casualties." Only when I heard the confirmation "Roger" on the way over the radio did I loosen my grip a little. Enough for Richard to breathe but not escape. I crawled over to Sarah, my eyes never leaving him. Pulse, breath, checking her pupils. The reflexes of a combat medic took over, pushing everything else away. Then I looked up, straight at Helen. She was still standing there, tears streaming down her face but making no sound. I didn't say anything. I just looked at her. A cold stare. And I think, in that moment, she understood. Everything was truly over. The wail of a police siren shrieked from afar, getting closer. My anger didn't disappear. It just settled, turning into something colder, sharper. The screeching sound of the ambulance siren echoed in my head like artillery fire. I sat close to Sarah, holding her hand, which was getting colder. Her breathing was weak, but still there. Every time her fingers moved slightly, I felt like I still had a thin thread holding her back. Outside, through the frosted glass, I heard Richard shouting as the military police pushed his head down into the prisoner transport vehicle. He cursed, he shrieked, trying to prove he was the victim. His voice blended with the sirens, chaotic and maddening. I closed my eyes, forcing myself not to listen. In that moment, a memory pulled me back. She talked about her biological father, a kind, quiet man who used to make wooden toys for her when she was a child. Whenever she mentioned him, Sarah's eyes lit up, with a gentle smile, but then her voice dropped when she talked about his sudden death, and the void that followed, which paved the way for another name, Richard Kane. I still remember the feeling when Sarah talked about him, the man who entered her and her mother's lives with the appearance of a savior, a charming former logistics officer, promising to fill the void her father left behind. My mother believed him, she said, a sad smile passing over her lips. She needed someone to believe in. But Sarah, even as a child, saw something behind that glamorous facade. She spoke of his cold eyes, the way he looked at their house not as a home, but as a new territory to be conquered. Sarah was uneasy from the beginning. Each time she expressed her worry, Helen would dismiss it, telling her that she was imagining things or was too sensitive. I remember clearly Sarah sitting across from me that day, her hands clasped tightly together. Her voice trembled, but was firm. I've never trusted him. And I'm scared, David. Scared that my mom will never see his true nature. At that time, I took her hand and promised that if something terrible happened, I would stand between her and him, a simple promise. But it was everything. Now, in the ambulance, my hand was still holding hers, but Sarah no longer had the strength to respond. And I wondered, was this the day she had always feared? And did Richard Kane just bring us to the final stage of the nightmare he started years ago? The car abruptly braked as we reached the hospital, pulling me back to reality. They pushed Sarah's stretcher into the emergency room. The door opened, and then closed, right in front of me. I was left behind again. A few hours later, I was allowed to see her. Sarah was still in a coma, her arm bandaged, her face still bruised. I sat down, looking at the wounds on the woman I love, and the cold rage inside me rose again. This wasn't an accident. This was the result of something that had been nurtured for many years. I held her hand, my heart compressing into a silent rage. There was no screaming, no lament, only a steel coldness spreading through my veins. The memory Sarah once told me resurfaced, a story she only dared to tell me after we had been married for a while. Her voice had trembled as she recalled the night she turned 14. That night, Richard went mad over a dress. Sarah was wearing the dress her biological father had given her for his last birthday. Richard saw it, and his face darkened. You think you're a princess? In this house, you only do what I say. He snatched a plate of food from the table and threw it straight at the wall. The shattering sound was like a gunshot. Sarah said that Helen had stood there, trembling but silent, just like the night I saw her in our apartment. Not a single word of intervention, not a single protective gesture, but the most horrible thing wasn't the violence. It was the humiliation. Richard took her father's Navy medal, the only keepsake she had left. He sneered, then threw it on the tiled floor. Now, he snarled, I'm the only man in this house. For Sarah, when the medal hit the floor, the heaviest thing wasn't the sound of metal hitting the ground, but the feeling that her father was being trampled right in front of her eyes. That night, Richard not only destroyed memories, but also bound their spirits in his circle of fear. I looked at Sarah's motionless face. The bruises were not just from the blows of tonight. They were the marks of the many years she had endured in silence. His war with her family was now my war. And in my war, I never lose. The plan in my head began to form its first steps. Clear, precise, and with no room for forgiveness. The morning after the surgery, the doctor walked into the hospital room. His voice was professional, but I heard every word like a needle pricking my skin. She will make it. Not life-threatening, but, he paused, the psychological trauma may be long-lasting. It will take a lot of time to recover. I nodded. I sat there, in the sterile hospital corridor, the smell of disinfectant filling the air. The military police had taken an initial statement. Richard was in temporary detention. Helen had been taken to a separate room to calm down. Everything was going according to procedure. But in my head, a question kept repeating. How many cracks will never heal? And then, an old memory rushed back, not leaving me in peace. 2 years ago, when Sarah and I had just gotten married, the phone rang in the middle of the night. Sarah answered it. I saw her sit up in bed, her face pale. On the other end of the line, Helen's voice was trembling, choked with tears. Sarah, I can't take it anymore. He's going to kill me. She had called from a public phone booth a few miles from home. Richard had gone mad again. This time was even worse. She said he had threatened to end everything. Mom, come here, Sarah pleaded, her voice trembling. You'll be safe here. David and I will protect you. I snatched the phone. Helen, listen to me. I'll drive over and pick you up right away. Just tell me where you are. But on the other end of the line, there was only hesitation, and then fear. Number I can't. He'll find out. He'll kill both of you. Then go to the police station, I growled, trying to suppress my anger. Do something. Number I can't. You two live well. Please forget about me. And then she hung up. The next day, unable to sit still, I reported the incident to my legal unit. A civilian investigation was launched. Local police went to their house. But when the police asked, Helen denied everything. I remember the moment she looked straight into Sarah's eyes, then turned to the police officer, her voice trembling artificially. My daughter. She has some prejudice against her stepfather. Sometimes she exaggerates things. It's just a small argument, sir. I remember Sarah at that moment. She stood frozen, as if all the blood had been drained from her. The way she looked at her mother, it was no longer the look of a daughter, but of a victim who had just been buried alive for the second time by her own family. The investigation was closed. Richard had won. He called me right after, his voice full of self-satisfaction. I told you, Captain, don't meddle in my family's business. That night, Sarah cried, not because of Richard, but because of her mother. She chose him, David. She whispered, her voice hoarse. She chose to stay in hell. From that day on, we cut off all contact with Helen. In our small apartment, no one mentioned her anymore. Sarah once whispered to me, her voice raspy, if she chose him over me, then I don't have a mother anymore. I didn't object, because I knew that decision was the necessary cut for Sarah to move on with her life. Now, sitting next to my wife's hospital bed, looking at her bandaged body, I wondered, did Helen ever regret it? Or did she still believe that siding with Richard was the only way to survive? A military police officer approached, interrupting my thoughts. Captain Carter, we need to take Helen's statement, but she only wants to talk to you. I stood up. The coldness inside me was even more than the hospital floor. Fine. If she wanted to talk, I would listen. Listen to see who she would choose to protect this time. The room where they kept Helen was small and stark white, with only one chair and a table. She sat there, curled up, looking small and broken. A military police officer stood in the corner of the room, silent. She looked up as I entered, her swollen eyes full of faint hope. David. Sarah. How is she? I stood a distance from her, my arms crossed over my chest. My voice was flat. She's going to live. That's not what you really want to ask, is it? She flinched at my coldness. David, I'm sorry. I didn't know what to do. I tried. Tried what? I cut her off, my voice still low but sharp as a knife. Tried to stand by and watch your daughter get beaten unconscious. She burst into tears, sobbing uncontrollably. Tonight, he went crazy. He said he was going to kill me. I ran away. I didn't know where else to go but here. I just wanted to see Sarah, and then the fragmented pieces in my head began to fit together, forming a complete and chilling picture. I closed my eyes, visualizing the entire tragic sequence of events that night. Helen, after so many years of enduring, had finally reached her limit. She had done what she should have done 2 years ago. Run away. She had gone to the only place she thought was safe, to the daughter she had once rejected. But Richard, that monster, would not easily let his prey escape like that. He had followed her, maybe through the phone, or simply by guessing where she would go. He didn't come here to bring his wife home. He came to punish Helen for daring to run away, and to punish Sarah for daring to harbor the runaway. Tonight's attack was not a loss of control from drunkenness. It was a deliberate act of revenge. Richard wanted to show both mother and daughter that there was no escape. He wanted to prove that even with me here, even on a military base, he was still the one in power. And Sarah, my wife, she lay there, taking the blows. Not just for herself. She was beaten for opening the door to the very mother who had once turned her back on her. She was beaten for trying to protect the woman who had chosen silence to protect her abuser. I opened my eyes and looked straight at Helen. Her tears now, to me, had no value at all. You didn't run away, I said, my voice clear. You just brought your hell from your house to mine, and you let your daughter pay the price for your cowardice. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her with her own sobs. I went straight to the officer waiting in the hallway. I'm ready to give a full statement, I said, and I have something that will ensure Richard Kane never sees the light of day again. The military police officer, a young sergeant named Harris, looked at me with a serious expression. Captain, anything you have will be helpful. I left the hospital when Sarah was stable, leaving guards at the door to her room. I told them, no one is allowed to enter without me. They nodded, without asking further questions. The car took me back to our building. The hallway was now filled with yellow tape. Our apartment had been turned into a crime scene, and military police were still there, collecting evidence. I showed my ID, requesting access. I was no longer a husband just sitting by a hospital bed. I was an officer, and I needed to know the truth. Before, I had kept silent. I respected Sarah's decision to cut ties with her mother, to let the past lie. I did that because Helen had chosen her path, and I wouldn't interfere. But tonight, Richard had crossed the line. He had brought the war to my doorstep. He had touched Sarah. Before, this was their war. I had stayed out of it, because that was what Sarah wanted. But when he stepped across the threshold of my home, when he spilled my wife's blood on our floor, he made it my war. In my head, the image of Sarah covered in blood kept replaying. Her in the hospital bed, pale amidst the IV lines. I knew that if I didn't act, Kane would continue. And Helen, she would just stand still, crying in the corner, letting her own daughter's blood spread on the floor. I asked the technician to open the in-home camera system. The screen flickered, then the footage played. The scene was terrifyingly clear. A frantic knock on the door. Helen appeared on camera, her hair disheveled, her voice choked. Sarah, I have nowhere else to go. Please, let me in. Sarah quickly pulled her mother in, hugging her tightly. But before she could even sit down, the door was kicked open again. Richard Kane appeared, his large figure blocking the frame. His face was flushed, his eyes blazing with alcohol and rage. His voice roared. Thought you could run? Sarah stood in front of her mother, her voice trembling but firm. You're not going to touch her again. The video recorded every punch, every slap, every curse from Richard. It recorded Sarah falling to the floor. But she still tried to get up, still spread her arms to shield Helen. He continued to hit, each blow heavy, brutal, until she collapsed completely, and even more horrifying. It recorded the moment Helen cowered in the corner, her hands over her head, only sobbing, without moving, without calling for help, without calling the police, without once rushing to stop him. Her silence in the video was more frightening than Richard's roars. The rage in me surged again. I stood silently, watching the screen. Every detail was etched in my mind like a knife. This video was undeniable evidence to convict Cain. It was also a silent verdict for Helen, in the room filled with cold light. I realized the camera's eyes never close, and it had seen everything: Richard's brutality and the cowardice of the woman who was supposed to be a mother. I didn't wait for a miracle. I gave the video to the military legal unit. Those who had been skeptical, who had been cautious, now had no reason to hesitate. The images don't lie. The legal battle began. In the first hearing, Richard's lawyer painted a completely different picture. He argued that Richard only came to talk sense into his wife's stepdaughter, and that I, with my violent soldier's nature, had attacked him first. Helen's testimony, as I expected, was weak and full of contradictions. She cried as she talked about her fear, while also trying to downplay Richard's crimes, saying that he didn't mean to, and it was just the alcohol. I sat there, silent, observing. I saw the self-satisfied look on Richard's face as he believed he was in control of the situation. He didn't know that he was walking straight into the trap I had set. The military legal unit supported me wholeheartedly. I had given them a copy of the video, but asked them to hold on to it as a trump card, to be released only at the decisive moment. The final court date arrived. Sarah sat next to me, her hand tightly holding mine. She had physically recovered, but I could see the tension in her eyes. "I trust you," she whispered. That was all I needed. Richard's lawyer stood up again, eloquently defending his client. He ended by looking straight at the jury. "There is no evidence that my client intentionally assaulted Miss Carter. There is only the testimony of a vengeful soldier and an unstable mother. I move to dismiss all charges." The atmosphere in the courtroom became heavy. The judge looked at my lawyer. "Prosecution, do you have any rebuttal?" My lawyer, a seasoned major, stood up. "Your Honor, we do. We have a witness who never lies." He turned to me, and I nodded. A large screen was pulled down in the middle of the courtroom. I saw Richard's lawyer frown, and a flash of confusion crossed Richard's face. The prosecution would like to present the security footage recorded at Captain Carter's home on the night of the incident. The video began. The entire courtroom was silent. Everyone held their breath and watched. They saw Helen run in. They saw Richard kick the door open and storm in. They saw Sarah stand up to shield her mother. And then they saw the first punch. A gasp of horror came from the jury. They saw Sarah fall. They heard Richard's monstrous curses. And they saw Helen, cowering in the corner, completely silent. The video continued to play, recording all the brutality, when the scene of me bursting in and taking Richard down appeared on the screen. No one saw it as an act of aggression anymore. It was an act of rescue. The tape ended. The silence in the courtroom was as heavy as lead. I glanced at Richard. His self-satisfaction was gone. It was replaced by panic. His face was pale. He turned to look at his lawyer, but the lawyer was also frozen, his mouth agape, staring at the screen. Helen, sitting in the front row, had her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking uncontrollably. The judge banged his gavel. A dry thud rang out, putting an end to Richard's charade. "The jury can now go in to deliberate," he said. But his voice no longer held neutrality. "And I don't think we'll have to wait long." We didn't have to wait long. The jury returned in less than an hour. The verdict was read, clear and resounding. Richard Kane was found guilty on all counts: aggravated assault, illegal entry, and threats. He received a prison sentence of many years, long enough that when he gets out, he will only be a harmless old man. As the guards escorted him away, he no longer shrieked. He just looked at me, an empty stare filled with hatred and defeat. Sarah slowly recovered. The bruises on her face faded, and her arm returned to normal. But some nights, I could still feel her trembling in her sleep, and I knew the scar in her soul would be there for a very long time. I was always there, her pillar of support, the safe silence she needed. We didn't need to say much. We just needed to know the other was there. A few weeks after the trial, Helen began to contact us. First, with messages. "I'm sorry. I know I was wrong. Please give me a chance." We didn't reply. Then she started calling. Sarah never answered. Once I picked up. "What do you want?" I asked. "David, I just want to talk to Sarah." She sobbed on the other end of the line. "I want to apologize to her. I'm so lonely." "That loneliness is your choice," I replied, my voice cold, and then hung up. The climax was when she appeared at the base gate, begging to be let in. Sarah saw her from the window. She stood there for a long time, silent, watching the woman who gave birth to her crying outside the fence. I walked up next to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Whatever you want is fine." Sarah turned to look at me, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a clear determination in her eyes, replacing the sadness. Her pain had turned to steel. "No, David," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. I already gave her a chance. 2 years ago, I begged her to run away with me. That night, I opened the door for her. I stood in front of her. "I've done enough." She turned away from the window. "We don't owe her anything else." I nodded. No more words were needed. Our agreement was a clear, definitive ending. No torment, only pain that had turned into resolve. We blocked her number, didn't answer her letters, and cut off all communication. They no longer existed in our world. Sometimes, I heard about her through a few acquaintances, that she was still living alone in that old house, the house where the memory of her first husband was trampled, and where she chose to protect her second tyrant. People said she lived very quietly. She chose silence to keep her husband, and now that he was gone, she was left alone with that very silence. As for me and Sarah, we started over. In our small apartment, we rebuilt our peace. The scars were still there, but they were a reminder, not of the pain, but of the battle we had fought and won. We were free. Together, a new chapter began, not promising perfection, but it was ours alone, stable, secure, and not bound by the past.